a positive twist of 2.12%. This indeed is very significant. Well, it's a day to independence celebration, anniversary, Democracy Day, of course. And now, a Democracy Day, I beg your pardon, by tomorrow, June 12th, as instituted by the present administration. But let's do an overview from independence to date. The Nigerian nation has served as a political game arena for two different political regimes, namely democratic regime and military regime. As an adage goes, a woman who has married two men is in a better position to know which is manlier. To this extent, the objective of this discussion today is to carry out following a statistical investigation on Nigeria's system, which has experienced both democracy and military regimes, to determine which regime has brought greater level of economic growth. Now, in this report, we are looking at 11 economic growth variables such as gross domestic product per capita, food production per capita, and discomfort index was used in that report. Now, that report is tagged Democracy and Economic Growth Statistical Evidence from Nigeria, 1960 to 2002. The result shows that 7 out of the 11 variables indicated better performance during democracy compared to military rule, while both regimes performed abysmal in the remaining 4 variables. It is therefore recommended in that report that for greater economic growth, Nigeria should continue to embrace democracy and that well-articulated macroeconomic policies to encourage economic growth variables such as non-oil exports, foreign trade, private investment, food production, etc. should be made in democratic and good governance settings. Well, let's start our conversation this afternoon. I'll move straight to Abuja, where Professor Uche Uwaleke is the president of the Capital Markets Association of Nigeria, joins me to start this conversation. And later on the show, on the same topic, we will be speaking to Dr. Emeka Okengu, who would also be analyzing this same topic for us on the show today. Good afternoon, Professor Uwaleke, and thank you for being on the program.
Yeah, good afternoon, Tolu. It's indeed my pleasure.
I think we should start with a bit of history. Take us back where we started from, looking at our military regime comparing to democratic regime. We've gotten lots of reactions around this. Now, in your understanding, what are those things, those factors we could look at weighing both regimes?
Yeah, well, once again, thank you so much. You made a point when you cited a recent study that talked about a number of factors that played in favor of democratic regimes. Of course, that should be expected because democracy is associated with freedom of speech. It's also associated with the rule of law. And of course, when you have a democratic government, there is a tendency to that the public perception of the country, investors' confidence will be, a lot stronger than if it were a military regime. So it wouldn't be surprising if you have more capital flows in a democratic setting than in a military regime. Now, you talked about historical evidence. Of course, go back to if you go back to as early as the 60s. Yes, Nigeria got independence in 1960. Of course, between 1960 and 1966, thereabouts. Remember, the first National Development Plan was actually 1962 to 1968. But of course, that was truncated by the war, the military regime, and the war. So what we now find that much of the development plans we've had over the years, particularly during military regimes, characterized by political instability, much of those development plans, didn't really achieve any degree of success, to some extent. And that's, again, due to the point I made earlier, political instability. If you also take the case of the second National Development Plan, we had that between 70 and 74. And the third one from 75 to 80, that was also during the period of military regime. Now, I recall a statement made by Chief Philip Asiodu. That was in 2017, January or so, during the annual Daily Trust Dialogue, when Chief Philip Asiodu, was reported to have said that the third National Development Plan didn't really succeed, largely because it was abandoned by the regime that took over from General Gowon at the time. According to him, the then General Obasanjo was also part of those that drafted that third National Development Plan, 75 to 80. But of course, when he came on board as military head of state, he had to, according to him in that statement, he allegedly jettisoned it. So you can always attribute the failure of development plans over the years largely to regime change, changes, particularly during during military regimes. We also had, recall again, also had although that was during the IBB time, we had SAP, Structural Adjustment Program, that ran. By the way, we had the fourth National Development Plan, you recall, that was during the civilian regime of Shehu Shagari between 1980 and 1984. Then we had General Babangida that introduced the Structural Adjustment Program, which lasted right up to 1993. Yes, well, I think when he left office. Again, what I would say with respect to that was, yes, that program was well-intentioned, talking about the Structural Adjustment Program, but again, the problem was the implementation. The problem was the fact that it tended to put the cat before the horse. When I say well-intentioned, of course, the whole objective was to have the economy diversified and so on, to promote exports. But the problem with the measures taken, as I said earlier on, was like putting the cat before the horse. That's also required devaluing the naira to promote exports when we didn't have much we were exporting. Of course, after that, then we had the regime of Abacha. Sani Abacha had the Vision 2010, you recall. But the problem again with that Vision 2010 was also partly because it didn't receive any support, particularly international support. And to that extent, you could say that it's also affected the level of capital flows, the level of support we had from the rest of the world. So that's of course when the military regime ended under Abacha. Of course, we had the very brief period that Abubakar was there. But of course, since 1999, we've been enjoying return to civil rule, democracy, so to say. The regime of President Obasanjo, started the NEETS, the National Economic Empowerment Development Strategy, which I think took off about 2003. Of course, the overarching objective, has always remained the same. We want to diversify the economy and, of course, grow GDPs, and rest. And of course, during that period, one can also admit that we experienced some level of, strong GDP growth rate. I think average GDP growth rate in the 90s and early 20s was about, 20s rather, was about around 6%.
Yeah.
We recall too that during that period we had the telecom reforms. We also had the pension, reforms, and also the banking consolidation that took place in 2005. So all of that, contributed to, the kind of economic performance that we saw under the regime of Obasanjo. And again, remember too, it was also during that regime we had the debt, buyback arrangements. Nigeria got free from particularly the external debt stock, the Paris Club, debt, Paris and London Club debt that amounted to as much as $32 billion at the time. Of course, after Obasanjo, we had Yar'Adua, brief period. Yar'Adua had the 7-point agenda. Because of the brief stay, one cannot really assess that program very objectively. But of course, the Yar'Adua's regime was succeeded by Jonathan. Jonathan had the transformation agenda, and at some point, came up with the Vision 2020. It was under Jonathan too that we had some sort of reforms in the power sector, power sector reform, power sector privatization, which a lot of people will argue that was not properly done. Talking about those that acquired these assets, at the end of the day. But of course, that regime too, if you can also speak to the level of GDP growth that we had at the time. That's under the Jonathan regime. Then, of course, after Jonathan, we had Muhammad Buhari that came up with the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan in 2017 to 2020 ERGP. And after ERGP, we had the Medium-Term National Development Plan. So that is where we are today, and overall I would say that civilian regimes, just as that study has clearly shown, would appear to perform better than during periods of military regime.
Brilliant stuff. As always, Prof, I must thank you for that in-depth analysis, breakdown into series of regimes we've had before now. But let me ask you, in all of this, we've had series of policies, we've had series of Vision 2020 initiatives, 2010, like you mentioned, we had the Economic Growth Development Plan, series of all of this. And many analysts like you have also argued that Nigeria has not been lacking policies or initiatives like this one, but implementing them to the latter has been a challenge. What's your assessment about the implementation of most of these policies vis-a-vis what we have with President Bola Tinubu trying to implement his economic recovery plan? I could call it that. That's talking about the Renewed Hope Initiative, removal of subsidy, and of course, liberalization of the foreign exchange market, which is standing firm, saying we would follow this to the latter.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, want to identify this the fact that a number of them don't really start in time. If you look at that of President Obasanjo, for example, I mentioned earlier that the National Economic Empowerment Development Strategy didn't commence until 2-3 years into his first tenure. That was around 2003. Remember, he came in 1999. That was when that started. And if he hadn't done 2 terms, you would imagine that would be, dead on arrival. If you also take the case of Muhammad Buhari, Muhammad Buhari's second term, when I mean second, I mean as a civilian. Remember, he was there as a military head of state in 1984. Now, when he came in as president in 2015, there was no plan until 2017. March 2017, that was when the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, was launched, 2017 to 2020. And talking about that ERGP, I was looking at that document, not so long ago. looking at all the beautiful objectives that the ERGP had. For example, it said that by 2020, GDP growth rate should reach 7%. It had projected that GDP would grow, I think, at an average of 4.6% per annum, then reaching 7% by 2020. It had also projected that Nigeria would be able to, by 2020, ramp up oil production to 2.5 million barrels per day, to the point that would be able to even export refined petroleum products. So Nigeria would be a net exporter of refined petroleum products by the year 2020. Nigeria would be a net exporter of agri products, rice, cassava, groundnuts by the year 2020. And it also had the ambition, if I may call it that, of dropping unemployment rates from 14% at the time to 11% by 2020, creating in the process 15 million jobs, between 2017 to 2020. That's an average of 3.7 million, jobs a year. So when you look at all that, you can ask yourself, how many of such, targets, were hit? How many of them were, realized? You come to the realization that none of them, was actually met. And all these things I have mentioned. Yes, one takes into cognizance the fact that yes, in 2020 we had COVID, because they said by 2020 all those things would have reached peak. But before 2020, what happened? Now, a number of factors, which I would not only attribute to that of ARG, but all the ones, the precedents. We had in the past over-relied on oil revenues. Of course, when you have a plan, okay, you need money to fund the plan. And in funding such plans over time, unfortunately, we have been relying, too much on this same oil revenues. And anytime we had any shock, external shock, coming from that angle, of course, it affected every plan that we had. A good example was in 2016. I recall that oil price suddenly fell January or so, and that's plunged the economy into a recession. So going forward, I think that is one aspect we should particularly note, and I think the present administration recognizes that, which is also why, if you also, of course, you'll agree with me that a major pillar of the reforms, the current administration, is the tax reforms. The tax reforms are not only geared to improve the business environment, not only geared to, of course, encourage small businesses, promote small businesses, including through streamlining multiplicity of taxes. One of the objectives of the tax reforms is also to increase the non-oil revenues. Tax to GDP ratio at 10.8% or thereabout currently, one of the least in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have an average of 16%. So one of the objectives is to grow non-oil revenues, largely through expanding the the base, and also largely through improving collection efficiency, as opposed to increasing tax rates. So I think that angle is being recognized, and that is also where I think we are moving away from the past. Another thing I've also noticed is that in the past we didn't prioritize. We didn't recognize the power of the building blocks, the power of the enablers, and the major enabler when you are implementing reforms or when you are implementing plans. The major enablers are, one, infrastructure, and two, human capital, particularly education. When we say human capital, education and health, yes. But essentially, when you talk about infrastructure, I mean, it's a no-brainer that infrastructure is very, very necessary, particularly energy. Let me even not talk about roads, because former American President F. Kennedy said, his famous quote, America is not rich because it has good roads. It has good roads because it is rich, That quote is simply saying that it is wealth that is used to, build roads. That's why I'm saying let's even leave roads aside for now. But energy, and when I talk about energy, I'm talking about not only, fuel, petrol, very important, but also electricity. In fact, in particular, electricity. You can't drive development without electricity, without power. And that's why I don't feel happy that since 1999, we are still talking about 4,000, 5,000 megawatts of electricity. When countries like South Africa, I don't want, you know the numbers, okay? A country of, is it 50, 60 million people? They have as high as, 40,000, megawatts of electricity. Here we're talking about 4,000, 5,000, okay? A country of 200 million people. So electricity is very key. And I also want to believe that has been recognized, because if you don't handle the issue of energy, you can't you go far, in terms of implementing your reforms, in terms of developing the economy. So that's for infrastructure, okay? Since 1999, since 1960 up to date, if you look at the countries that were in the same level of development in Nigeria, talk about Malaysia, Indonesia in the 60s, they were also agrarian, like Nigeria in the 60s. They've all left us, okay? They've all left us. And that's also because of the way they have, developed. They recognized, the power of these enablers, these building blocks that, I talked about. The other one is education. Again, overemphasize the importance of education if you must, develop as a country. And when I talk about education, we often, when people talk about education, what comes to mind easily is access. Access, yes, is one. Today, yes, you can say since 1960 we've had, number of universities, for example, over 200. Okay, but that's not a measure of how far you have gone in terms of education. Okay, access to a large extent, yes. Quality is another thing. Okay, yes. But for me, what's even more important, okay, is relevance. Because when it comes to education, you're not only dealing with access and quality, you're also dealing with relevance. So what meant by relevance? You have a development plan. You want to be a net exporter of agri products, for example. Okay, so to what extent have you prioritized related courses in university and tertiary institutions?
Of course.
Okay, in line with that plan. So relevance is very important. And that's why I also think if we need to expand our productive base in this country today, if we must change our economic structure that, is still more in favor of services contributing over 50% to GDP. Okay, look at manufacturing and agriculture. If you look at their growth rate today,
yes, Prof.
Less than 3%. Okay, so if we have to change that narrative, then we'll have to do something about, skills. We'll have to do something about the courses, programs in the university, that are also linked to production.
All right.
Okay, then. As opposed to, a number of them which I don't want to mention. So it's important we prioritize
30 seconds, Prof.
These courses in the universities.
All
and that's why I also think that this program like NERF Fund, which we have today, the loan scheme to students, of course, is a good thing.
Yes,
but
Prof.
we should try to prioritize.
All right.
Okay, then. When we are giving out the loans, students that are in these programs that I call programs, should be given priority.
Professor Uche Uwaleke, that's our time, President, Capital Market Academics of Nigeria. I know we can take the whole hour to talk about Nigeria before independence, democracy, back to civilian rule and all, and we'll make real sense of that conversation. But thank you so much. I must thank you for your time. Do enjoy the rest of your day, and happy Democracy Day in advance.
Thank you, Tolu.
All right, there. Well, still to come on the show, we'll stay with this story.